It is Country Viewpoint here on Flow FM, and it is that time of year where the crops are growing and spraying is certainly needed across a big chunk of the Wimmera and the Mallee at the moment. Spray drift is something to be aware of, though, and to be wary of. And joining me on the line, a man who knows this topic well from Agriculture Victoria, it's Steve Field. Steve, welcome to Country Viewpoint. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. Recently, there was a press release that came out from Agriculture Victoria just warning people to stop and think about the risks associated with spray drift. And before we get started, I mean, the obvious question to ask you is spray drift creates some real damage and creates some issues for farmers around the farm that's actually at the centre of the spray drift. Is that the deal?
Yeah, look, spray drift is basically a term we use to describe the movement of a chemical from a target area to a non-target area. So it could be spraying a herbicide or an insecticide or a fungicide. Commonly, the herbicides are the ones that we get the most reports about because they're most visible sort of symptoms of spray drift when you start to see your neighbouring crop dying. But of course, if we're talking about insecticides, if they get into waterways, then there can be some pretty serious consequences for the environment too.
Absolutely. I mean, is it as simple as just saying, hey, if it's windy, don't spray? I mean, clearly it's not, but obviously wind direction is and strength is just one of the many factors involved in spray drift. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. And it's one of the main factors, obviously, because windy weather will move that chemical more easily off target. But spraying is, increasingly complex. But the complexity's not a bad thing. It actually helps farmers to actually reduce the risk. So if you're looking at the sort of complexity we're talking about, it's what height are you running your boom at, if you're talking about broadacre boom spraying.
Yep.
How fast are you travelling across the paddock? What nozzles are you using? And yeah, wind speed, wind direction, and is there an inversion present as well?
Steve, just how much damage can spray drift, significant amounts of spray drift, do to either neighbouring properties or neighbouring waterways?
Yeah, well, look, it really does depend on what sort of site is impacted. So, we've certainly prosecuted criminal cases where there's been significant damage, but we've also seen people sue their neighbours or insurance companies on behalf of the damaged parties, sue people that did the spraying, and the results of that can sometimes be in the millions of dollars.
Now, clearly it's not just farmers that need to be aware of this, but when it comes to spray drift, anyone who sprays, and I'm thinking specifically about councils who quite often use some form of spraying to control roadsides and verges and the like, they would need to be right on top of this as well. Do you do any work with councils and people from outside of the farming industry?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about chemical users, which is what the term we use to describe the people that we deal with, we're talking about the whole range. So contractors, council workers, orchardists, fruit and veggie growers, broadacre farmers, even dairy farmers that are renovating pasture. A whole kit and caboodle can be susceptible to spray drift. And yeah, if you're particularly focusing on councils, there have been certainly examples where contractors or council workers in the past have used chemicals on roadsides that have there's been a bit of rain and they've gone into the neighbouring paddock.
Now, the other side of things for those who have mixed farming systems, I mean, spray drift and where the spray actually goes inside your own property really matters, doesn't it? Particularly if you've got livestock that are grazed in pastures and whatnot, that can create all kinds of issues for animals on properties.
Yeah, absolutely. So making sure that you comply with withholding periods or re-entry periods or grazing periods. These periods of time are all specified on the label, and they're all important to make sure that any spraying is done in a safe manner and any residues have broken down to an appropriate level before, for example, stock re-enter. And we've certainly had examples in the past where if you're looking at vegetable growers, they're usually growing a number of different crops, usually in quite close proximity, and it's really important that they control their spraying and don't cause that little bit of slop over drift 5 metres down the paddock onto a different crop that the chemical's not registered on.
All kinds of unintended consequences if you don't get it right. I mean, I'm thinking specifically as well about the dairy industry. I know residue in milk can make that not fit for sale. So lots of things, lots of reasons to stay on top of your spray drift, right?
Yeah, look, market access is increasingly important for all of our primary producers. And so one of the core things one of the core risks we want people to be managing is the risk of residues. So, our export markets all have different maximum residue limits than what we have here, or usually do. I won't say all. So it's really important that we're all working together and making sure to manage this risk of residues.
Now, I imagine that everything that we're talking about today here on Country Viewpoint, the average person involved in farming, mixed farming, cropping systems, as an agronomist, whatnot, would be aware of these sort of things already. But clearly this is a campaign of awareness just to make people aware and shine a bit of a light on the issue of spray drift before it becomes a significant issue. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a wealth of really good material out there now that industry have taken charge of producing, whether we're talking about GRDC or other industry groups, that really will help people manage those risks. And there's other people you can lean on too. Sometimes your local agronomist can be a really good resource to tap into. Nozzle manufacturers, even chemical manufacturers themselves have good people to speak to. But taking the time to just pause and read through the label that's on the chemical is actually really important to managing spray drift. There are more instructions than ever on newer chemical labels that will help give you direction as to how to prevent spray drift. In the past, old labels used to basically say, don't cause spray drift, and it wasn't really very useful for farmers to actually just read that. We needed to provide them better instructions. So the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, the Commonwealth body that registers chemicals, have changed the way that they're describing spray drift on labels. So you'll see a little section on labels called spray drift restraints, and that'll talk about the wind speed within which you can safely use the chemical. It might list some mandatory buffer distances that have to be used when you're spraying and there's a sensitive site downwind. It might even talk about the nozzles that you need to be using. Taking the time to actually read that is a really good preventative tool to minimise the risk of this occurring.
Absolutely. Steve, I've noticed, and it's an example of doing some research on the topic for those involved in the industry, but thankfully Agriculture Victoria have done a lot of this research themselves and put together a resources kit for people that I'm looking at it right now. It's freely available on your website, and that's a really good place to start if you want some more information about spray drift.
Yeah, absolutely. Our website's got that information, and like I mentioned, the industry, particularly GRDC, have got some really good information out there. It is important to take the time to read through this because there are increasing expectations on all of our chemical users to use chemicals appropriately. As we sort of see the community develop their interest in the use of chemicals, whether that's glyphosate or other chemicals, their expectations are increasingly. They're expecting us to be using chemicals appropriately. So it's really important that we're able to demonstrate that Victorian chemical users are using them appropriately.
Absolutely. Steve Field, great chatting with you today. An important topic and one that it's nice to shine a light on. Look forward to catching up with you in the future here on Country Viewpoint.
No worries. Thank you.